الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر
Hi and welcome to Worlds Apart, a program that is committed to speaking the truth in love. I'm your host, Roman Gossain, and today we have with us Jay Smith, who'll be speaking to us about ideologies that are worlds apart. Welcome to the show, Jay.
Hey, thanks for having me.
It's a real pleasure to have you here with us. Now, we've been speaking a lot about Islam and about Muslims. Let's now, in this particular episode, speak about Christianity. What is Christianity? How do you define it?
Well, Christianity follows the name of the person in the name, and that is Christ himself. Christianity is that which Christ brings. And it's not just revelation. Christianity is what Christ does. A Christian is someone who accepts what Christ did by dying on the cross and rising again. Now, to understand that, you're going to have to back up even further. And many Muslims ask me this. I always say, listen, you go on about sin and salvation. You go on and on about all these problems that you have concerning having Christ having to come and die on the cross. Why don't you just have a bigger God, a God who just accepts the sin and pardons it, forgives it? God of mercy, God of compassion. Al-Rahman, Al-Rahim, the names of mercy and compassion that we see all the time in the Quran. Why don't you let your God just basically forgive it like our God does? And I said, well, you have no idea what sin is. You have no idea of the importance of sin. To understand Christianity, you need to go back to Judaism. You need to go back to the very beginning of Judaism. You need to go back to the very beginning of the Bible. You need to go back to chapters 2 and 3 of Genesis. In chapter 2 or 3 of Genesis, and here's why I say to Muslims, come with me because you've got the same story. You have the story of the Garden of Eden. The Garden of Eden in Genesis is a garden where Adam and Eve, in the Quranic account, in Surah 5, in Surah 7, and Surah 20, those are the three surahs that refer to this event in the Quran. When you look at the story, Adam and Hawa are in a garden, as you are found in Genesis 2 and 3. But here's the problem. The garden that we see in Genesis 2 and 3 is a garden that's quite different than the one we see in the Quran. When you look at the Genesis chapter 3, verse 8 and 9, who's in that garden? Well, verse 8 and 9 says, God is walking in the cool of the day. So he has a pair of legs. God is in that garden walking. And he's calling out, Adam, where are you?
That's right.
He has a voice. So in the Genesis account, God comes into the garden and he walks and talks. In the Quranic account, that doesn't even exist. There is no reference to Allah in that garden at all. And because of that point, everything falls to pieces. And that's why, in some ways, we're just talking past each other as Muslims and Christians. Until Muslims are going to come back and see what we've got, they'll have no idea what sin has done. And they'll have no idea what Christianity is all about. They'll have no idea why Christ had to come. Because in the very beginning, according to Genesis 3, verse 8 and 9, God was in relationship with man. God was walking in the garden. God was talking with Adam and Eve. That relationship was a personal relationship. That means man and God were together in the same place. Then something happened.
Wow.
One sin happened. One disobedience. That's all it took. Just one sin. Adam and Eve disobeyed God by eating of the fruit. And immediately that set into progression a whole repercussion of events.
Yep.
Let me just give you an example. First and foremost, you see in the Garden of Eden that there was a perfect place. It was a perfect environment. There were fruit trees. They got all the food. Their food was free. It didn't cost a thing. They didn't even have to work for their food. It was just provided for them freely. They had a perfect relationship with the animals. They named the animals. They had a perfect relationship with themselves. They didn't even know anything was wrong with their nakedness. They walked around naked without any problem. They had a perfect relationship with their environment. There was no thorns, no thistles. There was no evilness. There was nothing that was impervious to them. And most importantly, they had a perfect relationship with their God. They were walking and talking in the cool of the day, it says, in verse 8 and 9 of chapter 3. But when they ate of that fruit, every one of those was destroyed. Every one of those destroyed. Now that relationship with the animal kingdom was destroyed. That relationship with their environment was destroyed. Now there were thorns, it says in chapter 3. There were thistles. Now women would have childbirth pains. Now man had to work the ground for his food. So he had to, by his own sweat. They now looked at themselves, saw that they were naked, they knew something was wrong. They quickly covered themselves up because they were embarrassed. That relationship with themselves was destroyed, but most importantly, they had to be thrown out of the garden. They had to be thrown out of God's presence. Now, no longer could they walk and talk in the cool of the day. The enormity of what one sin had done. Muslims have no idea of what sin has done. Sin has destroyed all that. All of that is destroyed.
Wow.
Now, Muslims come back to me and they say, hold on, Mr. Smith. Why are you making such a big a thing of it? That was Adam and Eve's sin. It was only for them. I said, no, you Muslims have no idea what you're talking about. I asked my Muslim friends, and I say this to you who are watching. You Muslims who say that sin was for Adam and Eve only need to look back at your Quran, because in your Quran, in Surah 5, Surah 7, and in Surah 20, it's very clear that your garden, the garden that's in the Quran, is up in space, right? It's not on earth. It's somewhere up in space. When Adam and Eve did that sin, they were then condemned for that sin according to your Quran. In Surah 7, they are then pardoned for that sin, but then look what God does. Well, look what Allah does. He then throws them out of that garden down to earth. Throws them down to earth. So I ask you Muslims, if you believe that sin was only for Adam and Eve, are you up in that garden? Are you up in space? The fact that none of you are up in space, the fact that none of you in the Garden of Eden, the fact that you're all living on earth means we're all imputed with that sin. As much as you like to argue against it, the Quran confronts you on this. Now, the Quran is very confused on this issue. In Surah 53, Ayah 38, and in Surah 6, Ayah 138, it says very clearly, for no one can take on the sin of another. And that's put there basically to say we can't take on the sin of Adam and Eve. That's why those two verses are included in the Quran. Okay, Surah 53, Ayah 38, and Surah 6, Ayah 136, excuse me. No one can take on the sin of another. If we can't take on the sin of another, then why aren't we up in the Garden of Eden? Why is it we're not up there where they were? The fact that we're on earth says we're all imputed with that sin. The Quran agrees with the Bible, though it doesn't understand why. And that's why I asked my Muslim friend, why then were we sent down to earth? Why was Adam and Eve sent to earth? If they were forgiven, why were they then sent to earth? And why are we all on earth? Why are none of us up in that garden? I have never in 29 years of working with Muslims heard an answer to that. They can't answer it. Because what the Quran has done is it's taken a story from the Bible, they've taken the story from the Bible, and they have incorporated in the text, but they've missed the most important ingredients. Those two little verses, verse 8 and 9. God walking and talking in the cool of the day with Adam and Eve. They missed the fact that we were in relationship with God at one time. Therefore, now we understand why they had to be thrown out of the Garden of Eden, because God cannot look upon sin. Habakkuk chapter 1 verse 13 is very clear. God may not look upon sin. God is so holy, He cannot have sin in His presence. Therefore, He had to throw us out. We cannot be in His presence because we are sinful. And every one of us is imputed with that sin. Both the Quran and the Bible agree on that point. If we're all imputed with that sin, that means we can't be in God's presence anymore, can we?
No.
We've got a problem, don't we? No, we don't. Because the Bible gives a solution.
That's right.
I love it. This is why I love my God. Well, I love him for many other things too. But He provides the solution in the very same scenario that He condemns Adam and Eve there in chapter 3 of Genesis. In verse 15, He then turns towards Eve and He gives a solution. He turns towards Eve and He says to Eve, there will be someone who comes in your line. That means someone's going to come from the line of Eve. It has to be a woman. He, that means third person singular masculine. It's going to be a male. That male is going to come and he's going to crush the head of Satan. Now, when you crush the head of Satan, what do? You destroy Satan. That person who comes in the line of Eve is going to crush the head of Satan, and Satan's going to bruise his heel. That's the first prophecy we have in the Bible of the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. That's the first. And it's in the very same scenario that He condemns Adam and Eve. So it's going to be a man. It's going to come in the line of Eve. It has to be from a woman. And He is going to come and do something that destroys Satan. So what do? We look through the Bible and we see where God is basically, He's telling us little keys all the way through Scripture who that person is. We know that He's going to be the Messiah, that the Messiah is going to come to save what? He is anointed to save from sin. We know that in Leviticus chapter 17, it's very clear that the atonement that is needed has to require a life, that blood must be shed. Life must be given. So it must be a life that is shed to atone for that sin. But it can't just be any life. And we see this in the whole sacrificial system. Now, Muslims know this. You Muslims know that you're to sacrifice. But go back and ask, where did the whole sacrificial system begin? To understand that, you need to come back to the Bible. You need to come back to Genesis 15. Genesis 15 gives the story of how Abraham was told by God to create and start the sacrificial system. And what does He say to Abraham? He says, I want you to take 3 animals and 3 birds. and I want you to bring him to this rock. And then he says, I want you to kill them, split them in half. Why? Because he was using a covenantal paradigm that Abraham knew. This is what was practiced there in Mesopotamia. He knew exactly about it. And that this was going to be the sacrificial system was going to enunciate or create. That was going to be the creation of the whole sacrificial system. Both parties should walk through, both of the animals and the birds, so that they seal the covenant with blood. But look and see what God does next. He puts Abraham to sleep. In chapter 15, he puts Abraham to sleep.
That's right, a deep sleep, I think.
A deep sleep, and only God goes through as a fiery brand, leaving Abraham there so that Abraham could not fulfill that covenant, because a man is absolutely unable to fulfill that covenant. This is a covenant that only God can fulfill. This is a covenant that only God must do. This is a sacrifice that only God can do, because it has to be he who is sacrificed has to pay the penalty for that sacrifice. He who is sinned against, he who was sinned against, who must pay that sacrifice. It was God that was sinned against who's going to pay that sacrifice. That's why the whole sacrificial system was created on that paradigm. Now, Muslims are still sacrificing today. They have no idea that there's no need to anymore. Because we know, and every Muslim knows, that when they sacrifice, they're supposed to get an unblemished goat to prefigure that later sacrifice. Unblemished means it has to be a perfect goat. Well, who is the only perfect sacrificed?
Jesus.
God himself.
Yes.
It has to be God. So it has to be God who comes as a man, and that's what Isaiah chapter 7 verse 14 that we quoted in another episode is going to come through a virgin. We know who that virgin is, and every Muslim knows who that virgin is. It has to be Mary. And he's going to come as God with us. So God's going to take himself down to earth. He's going to come to earth in the form of a baby through a virgin and live for 33 years. And it's that God who becomes a man who then has to die, and by dying for us, take on the penalty, the atonement that is demanded there in Leviticus 17. That penalty has to be a blood sacrifice. He has to die. But by doing that, he crushes the head of Satan, destroys Satan, though Satan bruises his heel. That's why Christianity cannot just be answered in one sentence.
That's right.
Christianity, by definition, is the whole amalgamation. What God had intended from the very beginning, after the fall of man, it is basically the fulfillment of everything he promised. Christianity is Christ coming as that fulfillment. Christ coming as that sacrifice. Christ coming as our atonement. Christ dying and taking on his blood for us. Christ's fulfillment of everything God intended to do through a woman, Eve, a virgin, to come to earth as a man, as God-man, to take on that sin for us. That's Christianity.
Wow.
You accept that. That's all you have to accept.
That's
what Christ has
excellent.
done for us.
Now, Jesus claimed to be the way, the truth, and the life. If I can just hone in on that word truth. So he was the embodiment of truth. In other words, a Christian needs to always say the truth, speak the truth, reveal the truth. Everything that he does needs to be embodied in truth. Is that concept the same with in Islam?
Well, you're asking a very difficult question here, because Muslims don't like to answer that question, because there is built into Islam a idea of taqiyya. Taqiyya is the idea that when you're outside of the realm of Islam, when you're outside of Dar al-Islam, House of Islam, whenever you're outside of that, you're in the context of war. In fact, the name of those who are outside of Islam are known as Dar al-Harb. Dar al-Harb means house of war. So anybody that's not in the house of Islam is in the house of war. When you're in the context of war, you don't have to tell the truth. Obviously, you know that in any warfare situation, you can. In fact, you're enjoined by your superiors to basically to lie, to cheat, because you do not want to help your enemies. So when you're in the context of the enemy's camp, you can lie, cheat, steal, do anything you want. Now, it's not the Muslims lie, cheat, and steal all the time, but they're given that right if they must defend their faith. And certainly if they must defend their religion.
But I mean, that's a little bit different. I mean, if we're supposed to reflect God, and God is holy, he is truth, he doesn't accept sin, not one iota. How is it that he can, through the Quran, give a provision that is Allah, so that a faithful Muslim can lie?
Well, you can see that Muhammad did that himself. And so in the Hudaybiyah agreement, and you can see there are examples of it, where he went to the Jews there in Medina, and he said to them, he demanded that they support him in the Treaty of Medina itself, which was there instituted in about 622 between 622 and 624, that treaty started with the injunction that every Jew must honor Muhammad as a prophet. Now, what Jew can honor Muhammad as a prophet? How could they sign a treaty like that? And when they refused, or if they did sign it, they could not have signed that article in it, because I could not sign an article like you could not sign an article like that. None of us could sit here and say that we can adhere or accept that Muhammad is a prophet for the same reasons that that the Jews in Medina could not, because he didn't fulfill the prophetic office. He was not in the prophetic line. He did not do anything to prove he was a prophet. His revelation contradicted much of what the Jews knew about God, and he didn't even know God's personal name. He didn't know God personally. So there's that taqiyya that right there, because then when they refused to support him, he then used that Treaty of Medina to throw at them, say, because of the fact that you've signed this treaty, which stipulates that I'm a prophet, you must therefore support me, defend me. And when they refused to do that, the Battle of Badr in 624, look what he did. He turned on the Jews. And he threw the first Jewish tribe out. The Banu Qanuqa were thrown out of Medina. A year later, in 625, when the Meccans came to confront and attack the Medinans there at the Battle of Uhud, he lost that battle. Muhammad was gravely wounded, almost killed, came back angered, and he went to the Jews again. And he says, you hadn't supported me? He threw out the Banu Nadir family. And you know what happened in 627, 2 years later, when after the Battle of the Trenches, he came back and he took all 800 of the Jewish men of the Banu Qurayza family, all 800, and slit their throats in one afternoon. Now, that's highly heinous. We would call that genocide. The reason I bring that up is, was he being truthful and was he being honest to those Jews? Absolutely not. This is the highest form of taqiyya. But more than that, I could give you example after example where Muslims today follow that example when they're in Dar al-Harb, when they are in the West. They can say whatever they want. I don't say all Muslims do this, but yes, they are all permitted to do this. That's why you need to be very careful when Muslims make a claim. You need to ask, is that their private face or is that their public face? More often than not, it would be their public face. You need to get back to that private face, that face that really is honest. And the only way to do that is to have relationships with them, to know them, and then to also hold them accountable to this book. Because they'll say an awful lot about this book that's just not there. They'll say an awful lot about the prophet that's just not there. They'll say an awful lot about themselves that's just not there. You need to get back underneath that to get to the real face, to the real Islam, to the real Quran, and to the real prophet. Once you do that, that's the kind of prophet and book, and also Muslim, I don't want to have anything a part of. That's why we don't do that. We don't have to use taqiyya. Jesus is very clear. Let your A be A, let your nay be nay. And he who's not willing to confess me in public is not worthy to be my disciple. Jesus says that over and over again. We must be willing to confess with our mouth that Jesus is God. Not just Lord, but God.
Also, I mean, since we're trying to talk or hone in, especially on Christians in this episode, what best describes a false Christian? I don't like asking this question, but it needs to be confronted, because not all people that say that just because they had Christian parents necessarily mean that they are Christian themselves. And it upsets me as well, because sometimes when Muslims look around, they perform their religious duties, they're committed, they're driven to pleasing God through the doctrines and the teachings that are left for them, whether it be in the Quran or in the Hadiths. However, they look around and they see all these Christians, and they smoke, they drink, they're involved in all sorts of sexual immorality. So how do you best describe a false Christian? So what I want to do is just to show to our Muslim brothers and sisters that there are false Christians out there.
I think the best answer for that, as to what describes a real Christian, is to say, who are those that follow Jesus Christ? You are not born a Christian. A Muslim is born a Muslim. You're born into a Muslim family, you're automatically a Muslim. There's nothing that you choose, it chooses you. Christianity starts with the exact opposite premise. You have to voluntarily choose to be a Christian, which means you have to voluntarily accept what Jesus did on the cross.
That's right.
Which means you have to accept that he died and rose again, which means that for a Christian, that's completely contrary to what Islam believes. So a Christian, a true Christian, is one who follows Christ. That's why the name is so important. That's why I refuse to give up that name. Now, there are nominal Christians just like there's nominal Muslims. And I would say the majority of people living in the West who claim to be Christians are nominal. Do they ever read the Bible? No. Do they even know who Jesus Christ is? They may. Do they know what he said? No. And they may go to the church maybe at Christmas time and at Easter, and that's it. Is that a real Christian? No, no, no. Then there's the liberals. Remember, we had the radical, nominal, liberal.
That's right.
Christians find that same thing. The liberals who have looked at the Bible have already rejected. There's a good number of them who are academics. In fact, there's a group called the Jesus Seminar in California that have looked at the New Testament documents, and they have gone right through, and they have put red or black or green beads in front of every verse to show which are authoritative, which are not, and which are true. And they have basically thrown out 82% of the New Testament and said only 18% are true. Now, what is their criteria? Well, they believe, first of all, there is no God that enters time and space. So anytime there's a miracle, they throw that out because there's no such thing as miracles. Anytime that there's any reference to something that has been written in earlier literature, like the Hillel School or earlier Jewish literature, you can throw that out. And so they start from a premise that I don't start, that you don't start, and I even know Muslims don't start. They don't believe that God can come to earth, or that there is a God that enters time and space, so therefore they don't believe that there is anything supernatural. And so if you start from that premise, then you might as well just throw the whole Bible out.
Exactly.
Why even keep 18%? They're liberals. They don't speak for me. They don't speak for you. Thank God they don't speak for Christianity. I always go back and I ask Christians the same thing I ask Muslims. Do you believe in Jesus Christ? And if do you follow what he did? JD. What would Jesus do? If you follow that small dictum, you will find what true Christianity is.
I'd like to just give you a couple of minutes. How do you become a Christian?
That all it takes is to acknowledge that God did come to earth, to acknowledge that he did die for you and me, to acknowledge that it was he that was on the cross, but he didn't stay on that cross. 3 days later, he rose again and destroyed death. That's all you have to acknowledge. You just have to say, Jesus, I believe what you did. I believe that you as God came to earth to die for my sins. Enter my heart.
Now, if any one of our viewers listen to that and they accept that and they do that, what would your encouragement be to them in the sense of how do they find their local church if they can? What's their next step? What do they do?
I think the best thing is for them to write it to Al Hayat and actually write this station and get the name, find out. We're going to put the name down here that they can write to. The address is going to be there. There's going to be an internet or an email that they can come to.
Yes.
Go to those, write to them. Find out where they're, because Al Hayat will tell you where your churches are in your local area. It will direct you to where you can get a strong evangelical church. You need to come to a church, to a fellowship of believers. You need to start reading the Bible, but that's hard to do unless you know how to go through it or what it means. Therefore, a church can help you. Al Hayat will make sure that they give you that information. So the first thing to do for those who are watching is to come back to that you can see the website that's on the bottom of your screen. Go ahead to that website, write it down, and then come back to us and make sure that they find out in their local area, because it's not good for them to go somewhere in another country or far away, and it's not good for them to just also pay attention and listen to things that are on the internet. They also need to go down and meet people, Christians face to face. They need to belong to a local fellowship. Every Muslim needs to do that. They can do that because there are Christians all over the world.
Thank you, Jay, once again for sharing some of your insights with us. We hope and pray that you found this episode to be very informative. May the Lord bless you, and please be sure to stay in tune for the very next episode. Goodbye.